Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto looked out over the turbulent waters of the Pacific from the deck of the battleship Yamato, his face calm despite the storm of thoughts within him. It was May 27th, 1942, and Japan appeared to be at the height of its imperial dominance. 6 months had passed since the attack on Pearl Harbor, and Japan's empire stretched across the Pacific, casting a long shadow over territories from Burma to the Aleutian Islands. But Yamamoto understood the fragility beneath the surface. He had told his staff just weeks earlier that Japan had run wild for 6 months, but the tide was about to turn. In Tokyo, the Naval High Command reveled in their triumphs. Their victories had surpassed even their boldest dreams. Singapore had fallen, the Philippines had been subdued, and the Dutch East Indies were firmly under Japanese control. Even Australia felt the threat of invasion. Senior officers like Admiral Matome Ugaki and Operations Chief Kameto Kuroshima believed it was time for a decisive strike that would force the United States into a peace settlement. Their plan was daring. Launch a diversionary attack on the Aleutians, then seize Midway Atoll, drawing the remaining American fleet into battle where it could be destroyed by superior Japanese force. In their Tokyo command rooms, surrounded by maps and models, the Japanese admirals acted with unwavering confidence. Captain Kuroshima confidently stated that, according to intelligence, the Americans had only 2 carriers left in the Pacific, Hornet and Enterprise. Yorktown, damaged in the Coral Sea battle, was thought to be out of commission for months. This assessment, gravely mistaken, was accepted without question. The Japanese Naval Intelligence Service, constrained by limited resources and cultural biases, had misjudged America's industrial capacity and will to fight. Historian John Toland notes that Yamamoto had his own reservations. He had studied at Harvard and served in Washington, giving him a clearer picture of American potential than most of his peers. Yet even he could not foresee the incredible effort underway at Pearl Harbor, where thousands of workers were racing against time to get Yorktown back into service. What should have taken 3 months was accomplished in just 3 days. The arrogance that would lead to Japan's undoing was summed up by Commander Minoru Genda, mastermind of the Pearl Harbor attack. He dismissed American strength, claiming they lacked the spirit and experience to stand against Japan's Navy. This dangerous overconfidence, later called victory disease, clouded the judgment of Japan's military leadership. The string of successes created an illusion of invincibility that blinded them to their own vulnerabilities and the growing strength of their adversaries. As Japan's massive fleet gathered at Hashirajima in late May, 162 ships, including 4 carriers, 11 battleships, and many cruisers and destroyers, few questioned the plan. It was a complex operation relying on precise timing and perfect coordination across thousands of miles. What the Japanese didn't realize was that American cryptanalysts had already cracked their codes. From far away, in secret rooms, American intelligence had deciphered their moves. The Japanese believed they were laying a trap, but it was actually they who were walking into one. By June 1st, 1942, Admiral Chester Nimitz stood at his post in Pearl Harbor, surrounded by intelligence confirming the Japanese target was Midway. The codebreakers of Station Hypo, led by Joseph Rochefort, had figured out the meaning of AF in intercepted messages. It was Midway. Nimitz saw the opportunity clearly and was determined to use everything at his disposal. The Americans had more strength than Japan realized. Yorktown, believed to be crippled, had been restored to service in just 72 hours by workers at Pearl Harbor. Though not fully repaired, she was seaworthy and would join Enterprise and Hornet, giving the U.S. 3 carriers, far more than the Japanese expected. Meanwhile, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo led the Japanese carrier force toward Midway with great confidence. His carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, had delivered the blow at Pearl Harbor and now carried over 200 aircraft flown by elite pilots. Historian Gordon Prange records that Nagumo showed less caution this time. He reportedly told his staff that the Americans would be caught off guard again, just like before. This grave miscalculation was due in part to Japan's ineffective intelligence. While American codebreakers had unraveled Japanese plans, Japan had no accurate picture of U.S. fleet movements and had stopped aerial surveillance of Pearl Harbor, missing evidence of Yorktown's swift return to service. As the Japanese moved eastward through the Pacific, Yamamoto remained aboard Yamato, far behind the main carrier force. This separation would prove costly, as communication delays meant decisions couldn't be made in real time. The fast-paced nature of carrier battles would demand instant responses, but the Japanese command structure wasn't set up for that kind of flexibility. War correspondent Robert Trumbull later wrote that this arrangement revealed the outdated mindset of the Japanese Navy. Even after Pearl Harbor had shown the power of aircraft carriers, Japan still placed its top commander with the battleship fleet instead of the more crucial carrier group. By June 3rd, PBY Catalina flying boats from Midway spotted the approaching Japanese fleet. Both sides were moving into position for what would become one of the most decisive naval battles in history. On Midway itself, a joint force of Marines, Army Air Forces, and Navy personnel prepared their defenses. Every aircraft available was armed and ready: Marine Corps Dauntless dive bombers, outdated Brewster Buffalo fighters, and slow-moving Army B-26 Marauders modified to carry torpedoes. The Japanese plan called for a dawn airstrike on June 4th to eliminate Midway's defenses, followed by an amphibious landing 2 days later. Once Midway was secured, Nagumo's carriers were to address any American naval response. Though elegant in its design, the plan lacked flexibility and did not anticipate unexpected variables, like the presence of American carriers that Japanese intelligence had failed to detect. As darkness fell on June 3rd, both fleets moved silently through the night toward their fateful engagement. Admiral Nimitz had placed his carriers northeast of Midway, ideally positioned to flank the Japanese carriers when they attacked the atoll. The stage was set, and Japanese commanders were unaware of the storm gathering beyond the horizon. At dawn on June 4th, Vice Admiral Nagumo's carriers turned into the wind, their decks bustling as aircraft were readied for launch. At precisely 4:25 a.m., the first wave of 108 Japanese bombers and fighters took off from Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, heading toward Midway. Unbeknownst to Nagumo, the American carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and the newly repaired Yorktown were just beyond the horizon, also preparing for battle. Rear Admirals Raymond Spruance and Frank Jack Fletcher commanded the American fleet and had achieved complete tactical surprise. The Japanese strike reached Midway at 6:30 a.m., where Marine Corps fighters rose to intercept them, but were outmatched by experienced Japanese pilots. On the ground, American personnel scrambled for cover as bombs cratered runways and ignited fuel stores. Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, leading the Japanese strike, radioed Nagumo to report the need for a second wave. This routine message forced Nagumo into a critical decision. He had a reserve group of aircraft armed for naval combat. He now had to choose between launching a second strike on Midway or holding the reserve in case of an American naval response. Nagumo faced a dilemma that highlighted the inflexibility of Japanese planning. The original operation had not considered a second attack on Midway, nor had it seriously anticipated early American carrier engagement. At 5:20 a.m., a PBY Catalina patrol aircraft spotted the Japanese carrier force and relayed its location. Minutes later, Admiral Fletcher ordered all 3 American carriers to launch their aircraft. Pilots took off into the morning sky with precise coordinates for their target, data the Japanese believed the Americans couldn't possibly have. Nagumo made his decision at 7:25 a.m. He would recover the Midway strike force, rearm the reserve planes with bombs suitable for land targets, and launch a second wave. This rearming process would take nearly 2 hours, leaving his carriers vulnerable. The flight decks were crowded with returning aircraft, fuel lines, bombs, and torpedoes. According to accounts in Shattered Sword, Japanese carriers could not simultaneously launch, recover, and rearm aircraft as American carriers could. Each operation required a cleared flight deck, making them less adaptable in combat. At 7:35 a.m., Japanese lookouts reported incoming planes. These were American attacks launched from Midway itself, brave but mostly ineffective. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol quickly shot down many of the incoming dive bombers and torpedo planes. Then at 7:44 a.m., a scout plane from the cruiser Tone, delayed in takeoff and late on its route, finally spotted the American carrier group. In that instant, Nagumo realized he had sailed directly into a trap. The second strike against Midway was cancelled, and orders were issued to rearm the aircraft once again, this time for ship-to-ship combat. But the timing was disastrous. The Japanese carrier decks were in chaos. Returning planes waiting to land, reserve aircraft being rearmed, fuel hoses snaking across the deck, and ordnance stacked in the open. It was at this moment that American carrier-based torpedo bombers from Hornet began their attack. Flying without fighter escort, they came in low over the sea in what was effectively a suicide mission. At 9:20 a.m., Lieutenant Commander John C. Waldron led 15 outdated TBD Devastator torpedo bombers from Hornet toward the Japanese fleet. They flew slowly, vulnerable to attack, but determined. Waldron had told his men that if only one plane remained, it should press on to try for a hit. As they approached, Japanese Zero fighters swarmed in. One by one, the slow American planes were shot down in flames. Not a single torpedo struck a target. Of the 30 men in Torpedo Squadron 8, only Ensign George Gay survived, floating in the ocean and witnessing the rest of the battle unfold around him. The torpedo squadrons from Enterprise and Yorktown met similar fates. By 10:24 a.m., 41 of the 44 American torpedo bombers launched that morning had been destroyed, and none had inflicted damage. From Nagumo's perspective aboard Akagi, it seemed the American assault had been spent in vain. But the real blow had yet to fall. Aboard the Japanese carrier Akagi, the command staff erupted in cheers as the last American torpedo planes were shot down in flames. Their celebration, however, was premature. What they didn't realize was that these seemingly futile attacks had accomplished something critical. They had pulled the Japanese Combat Air Patrol down to low altitude and completely disrupted flight operations on the carriers. Just as the Japanese believed they were in control, disaster descended from above. At 10:25 a.m., Lieutenant Commander Clarence Wade McCluskey, leading 37 dive bombers from the Enterprise, spotted the wake of a Japanese destroyer speeding through the water. He correctly guessed it was returning to the main carrier force and followed it, bringing him straight to the Japanese fleet. Around the same time, Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie arrived with dive bombers from the Yorktown. The Japanese carriers, in the middle of rearming and refueling aircraft with their fighter cover low to the sea, were now exposed to attack from above. Within 5 minutes, 3 of Japan's 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, were engulfed in flames. The Washington Post's war correspondent Joseph James Harsh later wrote that never before had such a powerful fleet been so quickly and decisively destroyed. In those minutes, the naval balance in the Pacific shifted irreversibly. On the bridge of the burning Akagi, Admiral Nagumo stood in shock as explosions rocked his flagship. Bombs had torn through the decks, igniting fuel and detonating armed planes. Captain Aoki approached, eyes wet, to inform him that the ship could not be saved and that his command flag must be transferred. Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, aboard the carrier Hiryu, immediately counterattacked. He launched what aircraft he had left and managed to severely damage the Yorktown before American dive bombers located and destroyed Hiryu later that afternoon. By nightfall, All 4 Japanese carriers were burning wrecks. Their crews were forced to abandon ship. Aboard the distant battleship Yamato, Admiral Yamamoto received word of the disaster in silence. According to his chief of staff, Admiral Ugaki, Yamamoto simply closed his eyes for a long time before issuing the order for the fleet to withdraw. The planned invasion of Midway was called off. The battle continued until June 6th as the Japanese retreated and American forces pressed forward. But the decisive moment had already passed on the morning of June 4th. In just a few minutes, Japan had lost 4 fleet carriers and hundreds of its most experienced pilots. More importantly, it lost the initiative in the Pacific, which it would never regain. Naval historian Samuel Eliot Morison later wrote that the American victory was due not only to courage and excellent intelligence, but also to superior naval doctrine. The U.S. focus on independent carrier task forces and rapid aggressive strikes had proven more effective than Japan's more rigid approach. As darkness fell on June 6th, the surviving Japanese ships withdrew, leaving behind only slicks of oil and debris marking the resting places of their great carriers. The Battle of Midway had ended, and with it, Japan's hopes for a quick end to the war in the Pacific. In the days following the battle, a heavy silence descended over the Japanese naval command in Tokyo. The loss of the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, along with more than 330 aircraft and over 3,000 sailors and aviators, was not just a military defeat, but a strategic disaster. Former Navy Minister Admiral Mitsumasa Yonai is reported to have said, "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." Though often attributed to Yamamoto in reference to Pearl Harbor, this quote more accurately reflects the dawning realization among Japanese leaders of the scale of their miscalculation. The psychological toll on the Japanese leadership was immense. Captain Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the Pearl Harbor attack and was wounded at Midway, later recalled that a gloom settled over the combined fleet. Japan had lost not just its carriers, but also the illusion of its invincibility. Perhaps the most devastating loss was that of the veteran pilots. These elite aviators had trained for years before the war and had honed their skills in China and the early Pacific campaigns. Japan's training system could not replace them quickly, certainly not in less than 2 years. While American industry was already building new carriers and training crews at a remarkable pace, historian John Toland described how the Japanese High Command kept the true extent of the defeat hidden from the public. On June 10th, the official communiqué falsely claimed that Japan had sunk 2 American carriers while losing only 1 of its own. Even the emperor was not told the full truth for several weeks. Admiral Yamamoto, who had opposed the war with the U.S. from the beginning due to his understanding of American industrial strength, now faced the daunting task of rebuilding Japan's carrier force while defending its overstretched empire. In a letter written in July 1942, he admitted, "The tide has turned. We have now passed the high water mark of our conquests." The repercussions of Midway echoed throughout the Pacific. Japan abandoned plans to expand further into New Caledonia, Fiji, and Samoa. The strategic initiative passed to the United States, which began its counteroffensive 2 months later with the invasion of Guadalcanal, launching the Long Island hopping campaign that would eventually lead to Japan's doorstep. In Washington, President Franklin Roosevelt and his military advisors immediately recognized the significance of the victory. On June 7th, the New York Times quoted a naval official who said, "Pearl Harbor has been partially avenged. This battle has changed the course of the war in the Pacific." Naval historians widely agree that Midway ranks with Salamis, Trafalgar, and Jutland as one of history's most decisive naval battles. Like those earlier encounters, it marked more than a tactical success. It was a strategic turning point. For the Japanese commanders who had orchestrated the operation, Midway was a harsh lesson in the brutal realities of modern naval warfare. Their failure was the result of flawed intelligence that underestimated American strength, an inflexible battle plan that left no room for improvisation, and overconfidence born from a streak of unbroken victories. They had also misjudged the very nature of the war they had entered. As historian H.P. Wilmot later wrote, Midway exposed the fatal gaps in Japanese strategy and ushered in a new phase of the conflict, one that Japan was increasingly ill-equipped to win. The Japanese defeat at Midway was not merely the result of isolated errors by individual officers at specific times. It revealed the collapse of an entire strategic vision. Japan had entered the war relying on the hope of an early, decisive victory, something Midway denied them. In the officer wardrooms and naval academies of the Imperial Japanese Navy, the search for blame began almost immediately, though cultural norms discouraged direct accusations. Admiral Nagumo, who led the carrier striking force, received much of the criticism for his decision to rearm his second-wave aircraft for a land strike rather than keeping them prepared for naval combat. But the deeper failure rested with the overall command structure. Admiral Yamamoto had dispersed his forces across a vast area, violating the principle of concentration. Reconnaissance was inadequate, and the operational plan was overly complex and rigid. Most importantly, Japan had severely underestimated American strength and determination. As the summer of 1942 turned to fall, the strategic initiative in the Pacific passed permanently to the United States. The Imperial Japanese Navy would never again launch a major offensive. From this point on, Japan was forced onto the defensive against a foe with superior industry, science, and strategic depth, a war it was not equipped to win. As 1942 ended and 1943 began, the consequences of the Midway disaster continued to spread throughout the Pacific. Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of Japan's naval strategy, found himself fighting a retreating war. In April 1943, American codebreakers intercepted his travel plans. P-38. Lightning fighters ambushed and shot down his transport over Bougainville, killing the man who had predicted Japan could run wild for 6 months, but no longer. His death symbolized Japan's deepening crisis. Their codes were compromised, their most capable leaders were gone, and their strategic options were narrowing. The seeds of this decline had been planted at Midway, where Japan lost its best carriers and most experienced naval aviators in a span of minutes. Admiral Nimitz later reflected that after Midway it was only a matter of time. The Japanese had lost their core striking power, just as American industrial output was reaching its peak. Shipyards in the United States were producing Essex-class carriers at a phenomenal rate. 15 would be commissioned before the war's end, compared to just 6 fleet carriers produced by Japan. Each new American carrier carried nearly 100 planes flown by pilots undergoing ever more advanced training. By June 1944, during the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the shift in balance became undeniable. In what Japanese pilots grimly called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, over 300 Japanese aircraft were shot down while the Americans lost only 29 planes. The battle effectively destroyed Japanese naval air power. According to historian Victor Davis Hanson, Midway was not just a tactical turning point but a conceptual one. Before Midway, Japanese leaders thought in terms of winning battles. Afterward, their focus shifted to avoiding defeat, a fundamentally different mindset. Japanese naval leadership had failed to grasp the full implications of their loss at Midway in 3 essential ways. First, they did not comprehend how quickly American industrial capacity would overwhelm them. By 1943, U.S. shipyards were producing nearly as much tonnage each year as the entire pre-war Japanese fleet. Second, they failed to recognize that the loss of experienced aviators created a training gap they could not close. While American pilots improved over time, Japanese pilot quality declined sharply. By 1944, many new Japanese pilots entered combat with fewer than 300 hours of training, a steep drop from the 1,000-hour standard before the war. Third, and perhaps most critically, they never fully understood the strategic impossibility of their position once their early gamble failed. Without a decisive initial blow, Japan simply did not have the resources to sustain a prolonged war against the United States. A correspondent for the London Times, writing in August 1945 as Japan faced imminent defeat, remarked that the path from Midway to Hiroshima was straight and unbroken. Once the Americans gained the initiative in 1942, Japan's loss became not just likely, but inevitable. For the architects of the Midway operation, Yamamoto, Nagumo, Yamaguchi, Kusaka, and others, the consequences were fatal. Most did not survive the war. Nagumo, removed from carrier command after Midway, eventually took his own life during the American invasion of Saipan in 1944. The decision to divide their forces, rely on inflexible plans, underestimate American strength, and cling to outdated assumptions despite changing conditions were all signs of deeper cultural and structural flaws in Japanese naval thinking. These flaws continued to hinder their efforts throughout the rest of the war. Naval historian Paul S. Dull concluded in his detailed study of the Imperial Japanese Navy that Midway was not an outlier, but the predictable outcome of a system that prioritized spirit over logistics, complex planning over flexibility, and offensive action regardless of the strategic cost. These values, once the advantage of surprise was gone, led inexorably to failure. When Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945, the shadow of Midway still loomed. The catastrophic misjudgments made 3 years earlier had reshaped the course of the Pacific War. In just 6 minutes on the morning of June 4, 1942, the strategic trajectory of the conflict was set. Everything that followed, the attritional battles in the Solomon Islands, the American advance through the Central Pacific, the desperate kamikaze attacks, the firebombing of cities, and the atomic bombings, traced back to that turning point when American dive bombers found their targets and forever changed the war. Admiral Nimitz, speaking at the dedication of the National Memorial Cemetery of the Pacific in 1949, put it plainly: Midway was the turning point. It was where the Japanese advance was halted and where the American return began, island by island, mile by mile, until the war came to an end. For Japan's admirals, the consequences of their failure at Midway would echo through history as one of the most decisive and instructive failures of strategic foresight in the annals of warfare.